So, my anatomy friends, we are continuing on with the GI tract, and I want to remind you of the two major themes which you need to remember as we move through this tract. And one is going to be all about mucus, and the other is going to be all about changes in the GI tract wall, which will accommodate for changes in volume and the ability to have vast amounts of surface area for absorption of nutrients. I already mentioned the four basic layers of the GI wall. Of course, they have to be called tunics because layers is too simplified. The mucosa is the deepest layer. There are going to be three sub-layers to that, which will include the epithelial layer. That is going to, of course, be the deepest layer, because remember, epithelium has to have an apical surface. Deep to that will be the lamina propria, which is a connective tissue section. And then we have the muscularis mucosa, which is sort of a separate muscular layer. Superficial to that will be the submucosa. Superficial to that will be the muscularis externa, and that is where most of the smooth muscle is going to live. And then we have the serosa. This shows you what's happening with the various layers. You can see the mucosa that is labeled there, and the three sublayers, including the epithelial layer, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa, then the submucosa, then the muscularis externa. And in the majority of the GI tract, you're going to have two layers in the muscularis layer. One will be of fibers that run longitudinally along the tract, and the other layer will be circular, which basically surrounds the diameter of the tract. And those two layers are going to provide very different movements for the food that you are trying to move along the GI tract. Certain segments of the GI tract will have a third layer, and we will address those as we get there. The superficial layer will be the serosa, which will have some epithelium on the very outside. The most superficial layer of the serosa will be epithelium. You will also have connective tissue as protection. And what else is listed there? Okay, the intrinsic nervous plexuses. Oh boy, we're going to have to spend some time with those. Those are totally cool. You have the myenteric nerve plexus and the submucosal nerve plexus. And let's stay tuned about those. So the mucosa is the innermost lining. Several functions, and different layers will perform either one function or all three of them. Do not be surprised that it secretes mucus. Some parts of it will also secrete digestive enzymes and hormones. So if you think back to when we talked about the endocrine system, I told you at one point that many structures in the body have endocrine-like functions because they secrete their own hormones. The GI tract is one of those. It will also absorb the end products of chemical digestion, and it is also going to protect against infectious diseases because, like the skin, it acts like a baggie, hopefully through which pathogens and toxins cannot travel. We talked about the three sublayers, the epithelial layer, the lamina propria, which is going to be that loose areolar connective tissue, and then the muscularis mucosa. Epithelial layer, simple columnar epithelium. And that's, you're going to find simple columnar epithelium along most of the GI tract. Although the beginning and the end will be composed of stratified squamous epithelium. Stop and think why. And we'll talk about why when we're in class. Of course, because the name is mucosa, it has to be associated with mucus. We need that mucus to help protect digestive organs from enzymes, to protect the wall of the lumen, and also to help lubricate the movement of the material that you are passing from the mouth down out the anus. We already mentioned that it may secrete hormones. It may also secrete enzymes, especially in the stomach and in the small intestine. The lamina propria is that layer of loose areolar connective tissue. It's going to be important because that's where you're going to house the capillary beds for nourishment and removal of wastes and absorption of digested macromolecules. It will also contain the lymphoid follicles that we talked about when we talked about GALT. And those areas are going to be really important in defending against microorganisms. So they are a crucial part of the immune system. And then we have the muscularis mucosa, which is going to allow for local movements of the mucosa. Because we are talking about parts of the GI tract that have epithelial layers, we need to talk about some of the specializations that go hand in hand with that. If you remember, think back to when you did histology and you learned about epithelial tissue, and one of the specializations being the microvilli. They are called microvilli because they are tiny little finger-like projections that you need an electron microscope to see. But those microvilli are going to live on top of villi, which are folds in the intestinal wall. So they are mucosal projections that are going to increase surface area for increased absorption. And if you are asked why we have villi or microvilli, you need to tell me this on the practical. Everybody listen up, because if you don't give me this whole answer, it will be marked wrong. They increase surface area for increased absorption. If you just tell me they increase surface area, big whoop, why do we care? And if you tell me they increase absorption, big whoop, how does it do it? You need to tell me that the villi and the microvilli are going to increase surface area for increased absorption. Now, we already mentioned the muscularis mucosa. It is associated with the mucosa, hence the name. This is going to be important because it changes the shape of the lumen and also helps move those circular folds on which the villi sit, the plicae circularis, and that just allows for some sort of accommodation as material moves through the lumen. The plicae circularis are circular folds that are permanent in the folds in the intestinal lining. Moving on to the submucosa, dense irregular connective tissue. And if you remember what dense irregular connective tissue looks like and what it contains, it's going to have a lot of collagen, and collagen is going to be important because it has a very high tensile strength. This layer will also contain blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. It will contain some exocrine glands, depending on where you are. And those exocrine glands will secrete buffers and enzymes into the GI tract, depending on where you are when we talk about the GI tract. It is also going to house lymphoid follicles, and it is going to be where the submucosal nerve plexus lives. More on that as we go through the system. Muscularis externa, think thick layer of smooth muscle. I already mentioned how they are going to have both two layers. One layer is going to be fibers that basically surround the GI tract, like circles would, like bands would, and the other layer is going to be longitudinal, so the fibers will run the length or run alongside the walls of the GI tract lengthwise. In some areas, like in between the esophagus and the stomach, and the stomach and the small intestine and the small and large intestines, there will be these thicker circular layers, which are known as sphincters, and their job is to help control the amount and timing of the material that is moving in between those organs. The myenteric nerve plexus, stay tuned on that, is going to live between those two muscular layers. The muscularis externa in general is going to be responsible for segmentation, which is basically just chopping up the ingested bolus or the ingested chyme into smaller sort of chunks so they can get flipped around more easily to expose them more to digestive enzymes, etc. And peristalsis, which are those smooth rhythmic waves which moves material along the length of the GI tract. And we'll go into that in a little bit more depth in the not so distant future. Don't forget the serosa, which, what a surprise, is the visceral peritoneum. It is an areolar connective tissue covering that will have epithelial tissue over the top. In the esophagus, it's going to be replaced by what's known as the adventitia, which is going to be fibrous connective tissue. The retroperitoneal organs will have both an adventitia and a serosa. There is no serosa in the oral cavity. That should make sense. The pharynx, the esophagus, and the rectum. Instead, those areas will be covered by that adventitia layer, which is basically just a sheath formed by a lot of interlocking collagen fibers. And remember, collagen has a very high tensile strength. And this shows you the diagram that we've seen and the layers again for reinforcement. And it also points out the myenteric nerve plexus and the submucosal nerve plexus. So since we just talked about those a little bit, that should make a little bit more sense. Now, back to Histology 101. Smooth muscle cells. Remember those smooth muscle cells? They are single nucleated, mononucleated, spindle-shaped cells that do not have a pattern, those patterns or striations in them that are going to be provided for cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle because of the sarcomeres. Smooth muscle are going to be particularly important in the digestive tract. It's going to form sheets and bundles and sheaths around tissues, around blood vessels. We know that it's going to be responsible for helping control blood flow and therefore blood pressure. We know that they're going to be sphincters, which are going to be those ring-shaped valves in various parts of the GI tract, which will control the movement of material between those organs. You will also have sphincters in the urinary system. More on that when we get to the urinary system. In the digestive tract, we know that there's going to be an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer. And within each layer, the cells are basically parallel to one another. The muscle cells themselves are pretty long, pretty slender. That's the length, that's the diameter. They do contain actin and myosin filaments, but they're very sort of loosely organized. It's not that repetitive pattern that forms the sarcomeres in skeletal and cardiac muscle, as I mentioned. There are no T-tubules. The sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is the endoplasmic reticulum that is specialized for muscle cells, is going to be sort of a loose network throughout the sarcoplasm. No myofibrils, no sarcomeres, and no striations, and hence the name smooth muscle because it has a smooth appearance on microscope. Peristalsis. We talked about peristalsis, or I mentioned peristalsis and segmentation before. Here we go. Peristalsis are those rhythmic waves of muscle contraction. When you take a bite of something and you chew it up, you compact it into what is known as a bolus, before you swallow it. And that bolus is a compact mass of material that is moist thanks to saliva and mucus. And that will move from the mouth through the pharynx into the esophagus. A bolus is going to be moved along the GI tract because of those smooth rhythmic waves of the muscles in the muscularis externa layer, and that is peristalsis. The circular layers are going to contract behind the bolus so it doesn't move backwards, it doesn't move up. And those longitudinal muscles ahead of the bolus will contract, and the process is going to repeat to move material along. This shows you what's happening. For those of you who are more visually oriented, there are also links to several really good videos that you should watch. Peristalsis is a wonderful thing. It really is quite amazing. We also have segmentation, which are going to be cycles of contraction of the circular muscles. And the purpose of this is because we want to churn and fragment the bolus that we have swallowed. It allows for increased mixing of contents with intestinal secretions. And there really is no set pattern of contractions, so there's not really a specific direction of movement, though material tends to move distally. It will occur in most of the areas of the small intestine and parts of the large intestine. And that shows you what's happening with segmentation. You can see that the material is being chunked up into smaller blobs, which allow for more mixing and therefore more injection of intestinal juices, which include things like hormones and enzymes. And this shows you peristalsis versus segmentation. Now, the enteric nervous system is the main division of the autonomic nervous system. It is a sort of second brain that's going to govern the functions of your digestive system and is composed of this really very dense mesh-like system of neurons. It is going to be the major nerve supply to the GI tract wall, and it is going to control motility, movement of material along the tract. We mentioned the two nerve plexuses. Here we go into a little bit more depth. They are going to be involved in the local control of digestive activities. So the ANS will also regulate these guys. Parasympathetic activation will increase digestive muscle tone and activity. Remember, rest and digest, rest and relax for parasympathetic. And sympathetic stimulation will decrease muscle tone and decrease activity because you don't want blood going, when you're in a sympathetic state, you don't want blood going off to your GI tract to help you digest. You want blood being rooted out to your skeletal muscles so you can either punch out the T-Rex or the saber-toothed tiger that you're being threatened by, or run like crazy and try and outpace them. The submucosal plexus is conveniently in the submucosal layer. It is going to innervate both the submucosa and the mucosa. It is going to be of sensory neurons, autonomically innervated. So as soon as you're autonomic, think automatic. You don't think about doing this. The myenteric plexus is going to be located in the muscularis externa layer between the circular layer and the longitudinal layer. And it will work with the submucosal plexus to coordinate the local control of digestive activity. This shows you the difference between the two. The submucosal plexus is also known as the Meissner's plexus. That's how I learned it. Meissner's plexus is a much older terminology. And the myenteric plexus is also known as the Auerbach's plexus. Again, much older terminology, but you may see that in some literature. When you talk about the submucosal nerve plexus or the submucosal plexus, It is going to regulate both the glands and smooth muscle in the mucosa, and the myenteric nerve plexus is going to control GI tract motility. I would know this slide, those 4 lines, if I were you, because there are questions on the assessments about those, and this slide will save you. The enteric nervous system, again, is going to be linked to the CNS through afferent visceral fibers, and those fibers are going to synapse with the enteric plexuses. We know that sympathetic impulses will inhibit digestive activity. We just discussed that. And we know that parasympathetic impulses will also stimulate digestive activities because parasympathetic impulses are associated with rest and digest. In the next section, we're going to start with the actual anatomy of the GI structures. More as it happens. Stay tuned.